If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Camping in the woods, Urpo Forest. I'll never forget the night my cousin Ben and I decided to camp out in Urpo Forest. It wasn't even our first time camping, so we thought we were prepared. Tent, food, flashlights, even a little hatchet just in case. Urpo was known for being remote, with thick trees and winding trails that seemed to go on forever. We'd chosen this particular spot because it was well off the main path, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the moonlight. It was perfect for getting away from everything, or so we thought. The first few hours were calm, just us chatting by the fire and listening to the occasional rustle in the underbrush. But as the night wore on, that peaceful stillness began to feel wrong, almost oppressive, like the forest was too quiet for its own good. It started around midnight. We were lying in the tent, scrolling through our phones and joking around, when we both heard something crunch just outside. At first, I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, nothing unusual for the area. Ben whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded but tried to downplay it. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and way too heavy for any animal. We froze, barely breathing, straining to hear more. There was a long pause, like whoever or whatever it was had stopped moving. And then, a low whistle cut through the silence, just a single eerie note, long and drawn out. I don't know why, but it sent a chill straight through me. I whispered to Ben, "Did you pack a whistle?" Even though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, his face pale, and gestured for me to stay quiet. We sat there in complete silence, staring at each other as that dreadful whistle echoed in my mind. Then, as if to confirm we weren't imagining things, another sound followed, a faint tapping on the side of our tent. Not like a branch brushing against it in the wind, but deliberate taps. 1, 2, 3. My chest tightened, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Ben mouthed, "What the hell?" I didn't have an answer. I reached for the hatchet we'd brought, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. The tapping stopped, but now we could hear movement, slow, measured footsteps circling the tent. I thought about unzipping the flap to see who, or what, it was, but fear held me back. Instead, I turned off my phone screen to minimize any light. That's when Ben nudged me and pointed toward the fabric of the tent. There, against the faint glow of the dying fire outside, we saw a shadow, a human figure standing completely still. It was close enough that we could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. Whoever it was wasn't moving, just standing there, like they were waiting for something. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. The shadow outside the tent stood motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it bent down slightly, and the shape of a hand reached toward the fabric. I thought for sure they were going to rip the tent open, but instead, they dragged something sharp across it, leaving a long, jagged scratch. The sound made my stomach turn. I wanted to yell, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Ben grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, his grip silently screaming what we were both thinking. "Don't make a sound." Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure straightened and began walking away, slowly, deliberately, like they wanted us to hear every step. We sat there in silence, too scared to check if they were truly gone. After a few minutes, we heard the whistle again, this time farther away, almost playful, like they were mocking us. I finally whispered to Ben, "We need to leave." He nodded, and we started gathering our things as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. Then, as we were zipping up the sleeping bags, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Through the small opening at the top of the tent, I could see the firelight reflecting off something shiny. Someone had left a small metal object right by the entrance of the tent. I leaned closer, trying to make out what it was without stepping outside. It looked like a knife, an old one, with a rusted blade and a worn wooden handle. My stomach churned at the thought of whoever left it there. Were they trying to scare us, or was it some kind of twisted message? Ben whispered, "Don't touch it," but I was already way ahead of him. There was no way I was going near it. We debated what to do next, our voices barely above a breath. Stay and wait till morning? Risk stepping out and running back to the car? Neither option felt safe. Then, before we could decide, a new sound broke through the silence. It was a thud, heavy and deliberate, coming from deeper in the forest. And then another. It was rhythmic, like someone chopping wood, but slower and off. I glanced at Ben, and the look on his face told me he was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't normal. We sat there paralyzed, listening to the eerie pattern for what felt like forever. Suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute it was deafening. And then, the whistle again, closer this time. That was it. "We're leaving," I hissed, not caring anymore if they heard us. We scrambled to get out of the tent, fumbling with the zipper in a panic. The moment we stepped outside, the cold air hit us like a slap, and the fire had burned down to almost nothing, just glowing embers. But the knife was still there, placed neatly in front of the entrance like it was waiting for us. My flashlight beam jittered as I tried to keep it steady, sweeping it over the area. I half expected to see the figure lurking behind a tree, but there was nothing. Just the dense woods stretching into darkness. That almost made it worse. Whoever had been stalking us could be anywhere. Ben grabbed my arm and whispered, "Let's go now." We headed toward the trail as fast as we could, trying to stay quiet but unable to avoid the crunch of leaves underfoot. Every sound felt magnified, the snapping of a twig, the rustle of branches, even our own breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following us, but the woods stayed eerily empty. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the faint glimmer of the parking lot through the trees. Relief washed over me, but just as we stepped out onto the gravel, a sharp metallic sound stopped us in our tracks. I turned the flashlight toward the source, and there it was, the knife from the tent, stuck upright in the ground, right in the middle of the trail we had just come from. Ben and I froze, staring at the knife as if it might move on its own. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. "How?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. There was no way anyone could have passed us without us seeing or hearing them. My flashlight beam wavered as I scanned the surrounding trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. It was like the forest itself was watching us. "Let's just go," I muttered, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him toward the car. We practically sprinted the last few feet to the car, fumbling with the keys in our rush to get inside. Ben kept looking over his shoulder, and I could feel my own skin crawling, like eyes were boring into my back. When we finally got in and locked the doors, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the empty trail ahead. For a split second, I felt a flicker of relief, until the whistle came again, this time from directly behind the car. Neither of us turned to look. I slammed my foot on the gas, and we tore out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the road. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the forest, not saying a word the entire time. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing us, but the road behind us stayed empty. When we finally pulled over at a gas station, both of us just sat there in silence for a moment, trying to catch our breath. My hands were still shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to check the time. It was almost 3 a.m., but it felt like days had passed. "What the hell was that?" Ben finally said, breaking the silence. I didn't have an answer for him. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was out there in Erpo Forest that night. We tried looking it up later, hoping to find stories or warnings about the area, but there was nothing. No missing person reports, no urban legends, no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of nowhere, stalking campers. It's been years, and I still can't get the sound of that whistle out of my head. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it again, low, drawn out, and haunting. I don't know if it's just my imagination or something worse, but one thing's for sure, I'm never setting foot in those woods again. Cabin in Oregon. I moved to Portland, Oregon, 2 years ago for a fresh start after a brutal divorce. At 36, I needed to reset my life, and the family cabin deep in the woods felt like the perfect escape. The place had been in our family for decades, a modest A-frame nestled near a lake, surrounded by towering pines. It wasn't much, just 2 small bedrooms, a creaky deck, and a wood stove that groaned like an old man on cold nights. But it had always been a sanctuary, a slice of peace. My only companion for this trip was Moose, my 3-year-old German Shepherd, who never left my side. It was early November, and the air was sharp with the promise of snow. I arrived late afternoon, unloaded my gear, and built a fire before darkness swallowed the woods. Moose sniffed around the cabin like he always did, his tail wagging as he rediscovered familiar scents. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin felt alive with warmth and comfort. I'd brought a stack of books and a bottle of bourbon, planning to spend the weekend off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me, Moose, and the woods. The first night passed without incident. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. Moose slept near the door, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old cabin. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on the window. It was faint, irregular, like small branches brushing against the glass. I dismissed it as the wind and went back to sleep, lulled by the warmth of the fire and Moose's steady breathing. The next morning, I took Moose out for a walk around the property. The ground was damp, and the air carried that earthy, clean smell you only get in the forest after rain. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. These prints were longer and narrower, almost claw-like, and they seemed to trail from the edge of the lake toward the cabin. I stood there for a moment, staring at them, my breath clouding in the cold air. Moose was ahead of me, sniffing furiously at the ground, his ears pinned back. He let out a low growl, a sound I'd rarely heard from him. The footprints unnerved me, but I convinced myself they were from some animal. A bear, maybe, or even a coyote. Still, they didn't look quite right, and the fact that they led toward the cabin sent a chill down my spine. I decided to keep Moose close for the rest of the day. He was restless, pacing by the windows and growling at nothing. At one point, he barked sharply, lunging toward the door. When I opened it, there was nothing outside but the dense trees and the sound of the wind whispering through them. That evening, as I sat by the fire with Moose curled at my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. Around 9 p.m., just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a loud thump on the roof. My heart jumped into my throat, and Moose shot to his feet, barking furiously. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling. It was deliberate, like something heavy had landed up there. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the slanted roof. There was nothing there. Just the eerie stillness of the forest, broken only by Moose's low growl. I tried to shake it off, but my nerves were frayed. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows and brought Moose's bed closer to mine. As I lay in the dark, every little noise seemed amplified. The creak of the wood, the wind howling through the trees. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate scraping sound coming from above. It was slow, methodical, like something was dragging across the roof. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, and Moose stood rigid, his ears perked and his body tense. I decided I couldn't just lie there. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I opened the front door and stepped outside, Moose close at my heels. The night was impossibly dark, the kind of black that swallows the beam of a flashlight after a few feet. I tilted the light toward the roof, but it revealed nothing. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It wasn't moving, just standing there, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Moose's growl turned into a bark, sharp and aggressive, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs looked wrong, stretched in ways that didn't seem natural. My first thought was that it might be some kind of hunter or hiker who'd lost their way, but something about the way it stood, so unnervingly still, killed that idea immediately. My flashlight's beam trembled as I aimed it toward the figure, but as soon as the light touched it, it disappeared. Not like it ran or ducked behind a tree, it simply wasn't there anymore. Moose barked wildly, lunging toward where the figure had been, but I yanked him back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I scrambled back inside, slamming the door and bolting it behind me. Moose barked at the door for what felt like an eternity, his fur bristled and his tail stiff. I turned off all the lights and sat there in the dark, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. The cabin felt suffocatingly quiet, but then the noises started again. Soft thuds on the roof, followed by the faintest whispering sound, like wind but wrong. It seemed to come from every direction, seeping through the walls. Moose whimpered now, his bark giving way to something that sounded almost like fear. For the first time in my life, I truly felt like prey. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, gripping that flashlight as if it could save me. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, but where would I even go? The cabin was miles from anything, and the forest outside felt alive, like it was holding its breath. Moose stayed glued to my side, trembling, a side of him I'd never seen before. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. The whispers faded, the thuds ceased, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was like the entire world had gone still, waiting. I decided I couldn't spend another second in the cabin. I grabbed my keys, shoved my feet into my boots, and threw on a jacket. Moose practically bolted out the door when I opened it, his leash trailing behind him. The air was icy and thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I was halfway to my truck when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and I turned, shining my flashlight into the woods. And there it was again. The figure. It stood closer this time, just beyond the tree line, its body unnaturally long, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. I swear its eyes glinted, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like a predator's. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them in the dirt. Moose barked at the figure, his growl deep and guttural, but he didn't move closer. When I finally managed to pick up the keys, I yanked the truck door open and shoved Moose inside. I barely had time to climb in myself before I saw movement. Slow, deliberate steps, the figure emerging just a bit further from the trees. It wasn't running, but the sheer calmness of its approach made my stomach churn. I started the engine, my heart racing, and floored the gas pedal. Gravel spat under the tires as I tore down the narrow dirt road, the headlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. For the first mile, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure running after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me and Moose whining softly in the passenger seat. I started to think I was safe, but then something hit the roof of the truck. Hard. It was a loud, metallic thud, followed by a scraping sound that seemed to drag across the length of the cab. I screamed, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Moose barked frantically, lunging toward the back window. I didn't dare stop. I pressed harder on the gas, swerving recklessly along the winding road. The sound on the roof stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving an eerie silence that made my ears ring. My gut told me not to slow down, so I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. Moose had stopped barking but was still on edge, his body rigid as he stared out the back window. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I reached the main road. The forest opened up, giving way to wide open space, and for the first time, I let out a shaky breath. I drove straight into town and parked in the lot of a well-lit gas station. The fluorescent lights felt like salvation after the oppressive darkness of the woods. I sat there for a while, engine idling, my hands still trembling. Moose was in the back seat now, lying down but alert, his ears twitching at every sound. I debated going back to the cabin to grab my stuff, but every fiber of my being told me not to. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. In the end, I called a friend who lived an hour away and crashed on their couch that night. The next morning, I called a local ranger station, trying to sound calm as I described the footprints and the noises on the roof. I left out the part about the figure. I knew how crazy it would sound. The ranger on the other end seemed polite but dismissive, chalking it up to animals. It's not uncommon for mountain lions to prowl around cabins this time of year, he said. But mountain lions don't leave footprints like that, and they certainly don't stand at the edge of the woods, staring like a sentient shadow. I didn't push the issue. What was the point? I never went back to the cabin after that. A week later, I hired a moving company to pack up my things, giving them vague instructions about what to leave behind. I didn't care about the old furniture or the stacks of books I'd brought with me. All I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods or what it wanted, and maybe I don't want to know. Sometimes at night, I'll hear a noise outside, branches scraping a window or the faint thud of something on the roof, and my heart will race, just for a second. It's probably nothing. At least, that's what I tell myself. Facebook Marketplace Trap. I should have known something was off from the start, but I guess hindsight's always 20/20ths. It all started when I found this ad on Facebook Marketplace for a used iPhone 13. The price was ridiculously good, almost too good, if I'm being honest. But the guy seemed legit. His profile had pictures, and he responded quickly when I messaged him. He said he was selling the phone because he upgraded, and we agreed to meet that same evening. I didn't think twice when he suggested a quiet spot near the edge of town, saying it was closer to where he lived. In my mind, it made sense. Public enough but not too crowded. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. I figured I'd just grab the phone and head home. When I got to the spot, it was eerier than I expected. It was one of those barely lit parking lots behind an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been open in years. There was this one flickering light above the lot, and the rest was just pitch black. I parked my car and messaged the guy to let him know I was there. He said he'd be a few minutes late. While waiting, I started feeling this weird sense of unease, like someone was watching me. But I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid because of how creepy the place looked. I sat in my car, scrolling on my phone to pass the time, but every few seconds, I kept glancing up at the rearview mirror. After about 10 minutes, I was getting frustrated. I messaged him again, asking if he was close. He replied almost instantly, saying he'd just pulled up but didn't see me. I looked around the parking lot. There was no one else there. My stomach dropped a little, but I convinced myself that maybe he parked on the other side of the gas station. So, I got out of my car to look around. The air was cold, and everything felt unnaturally still, like the kind of quiet where even the wind seems to hold its breath. I didn't see another car anywhere, just my own under that weak, flickering light. Then I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the darkness behind me. At first, I thought it was him, so I turned around and called out, "Hey, are you the guy with the phone?" No response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was just silence. I stood there, frozen, trying to peer into the shadows, but I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the light. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There wasn't just one shadow moving back there. There were two. I backed up toward my car instinctively, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. No answer, just the faint sound of movement, like shuffling feet on gravel. Then, out of nowhere, a man stepped into the light. He looked ordinary enough, wearing a hoodie and jeans, but something about the way he moved was off. He didn't say a word, just stared at me, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hood. I asked again, "Are you the guy with the phone?" He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't want to panic just yet. That's when I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. Another figure creeping closer, staying just outside the reach of the light. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to keep my voice steady enough to say, "Look, if this is a joke, it's not funny." The guy in the hoodie didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. He just took one slow step toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted toward my car. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled with my keys, dropping them as I tried to unlock the door. That's when I heard the sound of running, fast, heavy footsteps coming straight at me. I snatched up the keys and flung open the door just as one of them lunged. I didn't get a good look at his face, but I felt the impact as he slammed into the side of the car, missing me by inches. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine in what felt like a single motion. My headlights flooded the parking lot, and for a split second, I saw them, two men, standing there, watching me. One of them had something in his hand, a pipe or a bat maybe. I didn't stick around to find out. I threw the car into reverse so fast I nearly hit a dumpster, then sped out of there like my life depended on it. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them chasing after me. But they didn't. They just stood there, staring as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was back in a well-lit area with other cars and people around. Even then, I felt like my chest was going to explode. I pulled into a busy gas station and parked, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling as I grabbed my phone and debated calling the police. But what would I even say? "Hey, I went to buy a phone, and some guys scared the crap out of me." I didn't have their names, their license plates, nothing. And besides, they hadn't actually done anything, yet. That thought made me sick to my stomach. What if I hadn't gotten away? After sitting there for a while, I decided to check the guy's profile on Facebook. To my surprise, or maybe not, it was gone. Completely deleted. It was like he'd never existed. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some sketchy sale gone wrong. It was a setup. These guys weren't trying to sell a phone. They were trying to lure someone out there, someone they could catch off guard. And it almost worked. I don't know what they were planning to do, rob me, hurt me, or something worse, but I do know one thing. I'll never trust an online ad again. Even after I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that they might have followed me somehow. I checked my locks twice, even though I knew I hadn't seen any cars behind me. I sat in the dark living room for what felt like hours, just staring out the window and replaying everything in my head. Every small sound outside, branches rustling, a dog barking, sent a jolt through me. I kept telling myself I was safe now, but it didn't feel like it. That unsettling, watched feeling clung to me like a second skin. The scariest part is how close I came to ignoring my instincts. If I hadn't bolted when I did, who knows what would have happened? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The idea of what could have been is what keeps me awake at night, even now. I still wonder if those guys have done this to someone else, or if they're out there, waiting for another unlucky person to fall into their trap. I keep thinking about that last look they gave me, standing in the light, motionless. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was like they were amused. Like I was just the warm-up.